Hey y'all, I'm Sunny Shell, and tonight we're going to discuss grief and loss without religion. So sit back, buckle up, and let's get to the sunny spot on Skeptic Haven. Hey everyone, I'm Sunny Shell, and I'm so excited because I get to welcome Shannon Q. Hey Shannon.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on. And Sasha Sagan. Thank you so much for coming on, Sasha.
I'm so happy to be here. Hi.
Hi. And, we have a really important topic today that, as we were talking before the show, there's just not a whole lot of resources or people even talking about how to deal with loss and grief from a secular perspective. So I appreciate both of you guys for being open to having this discussion. And I think people are going to find it useful. So thank you. So, yeah, the first thing I want to do is give us a chance to talk about our own personal experiences with loss and kind of ground it in that, if that's okay. So either one of you that wants to start feels comfortable starting.
I'm happy to start. It's funny, even when I was like a really small child, as soon as I got wind of the idea that what we're doing is not forever, and whatever this is that animates us goes away, I was really fascinated with this idea and had a lot of questions about it. Still mostly unanswered. It was something that I wondered about and thought about a lot as a child. And then when I was 14, my dad, the astronomer and educator Carl Sagan, died. And, I think in a lot of ways that sort of sent me on my path to write about how we deal with these sort of changes in life, momentous occasions, and events without the infrastructure of religion. And I write about seasons, holidays and changing of seasons and marriages and babies being born. But I think at the core, the event in human existence that cries out the most to be acknowledged in some way, to be understood, to be recognized internally and through a community is loss, is the death of a loved one. And I was really close with my dad. He was a wonderful guy, and it's almost 25 years and I still miss him all the time. And I've had a couple of other deeply loved people in my life who are no longer here. And I think that those experiences, when you have an early profound loss, every other loss sort of connects back to that in a lot of ways. And so, these experiences, coupled with not being religious, not being raised in a religious way, have really made it so that what we're talking about today is sort of the most interesting question to me, is how do we reckon with this idea that this is finite without relying on anything that's not supported by evidence?
Yeah, absolutely. Shannon, how about your experience?
Well, I was a Christian previously, so I wasn't raised secular, and I deconverted kind of, I guess, later in life. I don't want to age myself too badly, but I'm 40. But so I've had losses prior, but last October I lost my dad, and it was the first real, big, intimately impactful loss that I had to go through as, kind of a card carrying, owning it atheist. And going through that experience, being true to myself for the first time, because in the past, even though I maybe would have been questioning or on the fence, or maybe even kind of almost all the way, I was still kind of willing to, or comforted by the vestiges of religion when it came to bonding with the other people who were sharing the experience with me. And this is the first time and was arguably the hardest death I've gone through in my life, that I had to do it without religion entirely, and saw religion instead almost as an impediment to my grief and a barrier between bonding with the other people who are grieving with me, and kind of a wall between us sharing that experience, which is something that is so important when you go through grief, being able to feel it and traverse it with the people around you who are sharing that experience. And that sparked in me a desire to open up broader dialogues about how we can, walk that path, because it's just not talked about enough. So I'm so glad that you're doing this, and I appreciate Sasha being here. It's very nice to meet you, and thank you very much for having us, so that we could create a broader pool of resources for people to draw from, because I think it's super important.
Absolutely. So those who have been viewers of this show know that that I also have a loss of my dad. He died 3 years ago in August, and I think I was religious at one point and deconverted, but my parents also deconverted. For a long time, they said that they believed in something, they just weren't sure quite what, but the biggest thing was do the best in this life as you can, leave it in a better place. That kind of became their religion. And then eventually it was like, no, we're atheists. And they were proudly, openly atheist. My experience was kind of hindered. My ability to kind of grieve my dad was a little bit hindered. And I feel that it was because of the religious around me. For instance, at work, I had all of my coworkers gather around and lay their hands on me and pray over me. And I was not in a place where I could object. It was not something I could object to. And I was so angry. And I don't know about you guys, but sometimes when I get angry, I cry.
Yeah. If I can't scream.
So I'm crying, and they're thinking
that you're so grief stricken.
Yes, it's like, look at this help that we're giving her, and I couldn't tell them. So that was a very difficult thing. The second thing that I noticed about my particular grieving process was quite a few years earlier, a friend of mine, her dad died very suddenly in a car accident, and it hit me very hard. It was almost like my dad had died, and I was thinking, how can she even carry on? And it was almost like I went through a grieving process at that point. So by the time that my dad died, and I was also a lot older, I am 48, and it was 3 years ago, and I think that has something to do with it, your age as well. I kind of felt like I went through a little bit of a grieving process, so that by the time he did die, it was almost like it wasn't as, it was painful, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't the way that I felt when my friend's dad had died when I was younger, if that makes any sense. So anyway, those were the two things with my experience. And I really think that it's important for us to have these type of discussions, because there's so many people who, especially new people, people who are just kind of deconverting or getting out of it. This can be one of the hardest things that they can go through regardless. But when you also have lost your faith, it's doubly hard. And so,
I think it's like the idea that there's an answer for this impossible question is one of the biggest selling points. I would argue that it's actually not a better method, but I think it's that's like one of the interior crises that people say, when they start to doubt. I think they say, it's the existential crisis of, but then what? We're just tiny specks of dust, and we're gonna die, and then that's it forever, and like everyone you love is gonna die, and it's just then the sun's gonna blow up. Like I feel like it's like that is like, I mean, right? It's a lot.
I've heard that,
and it's like I think that like that the idea of like, no, it's not that, it's something else. You're going to see them again and you get to keep going. And like, I think that is like kind of what religion is offering. It's like the big marquee advertisement of like what they have to offer. And I think that, so that you're right. I think that when people lose that, it feels like it's just the floor is ripped out from under them and it's like falling. But I think that, you know, it's a very short-term Band-Aid, that idea. And like, really, you know, I think if you start from a place where you're thinking, you know, this is it, we're here right now, it's brief, but we're together with our loved ones, and like, this is the moment that we have together, and it's so special and rare, and you know, it's like just being born at all is amazing. You know, I think if you can start with that kind of joyful appreciation of life earlier on, then I think that in certain ways, I mean, the death is still so painful and loss is still so hard, and it has to be acknowledged that that is true. But I think that the idea that this is a dress rehearsal and there's something better coming later is not as, that is not a source of joy and full realization for people. And I think that, you know, the idea that, you know, some people are going one place, some people are going somewhere else. You know, there's a lot that just doesn't hold water if the goal is to make you feel better about the idea that this whatever it is changes, goes away.
Yeah. Yep. I find I was so much better armed now to cope with the finality of it, like personally and individually, because I realized each moment was precious. There wasn't going to be another moment. And when the time came and he was gone, like I knew that was it. So I was able to build coping strategies that incorporated it being final. One of the things that I struggled with was the constitution of the people around me was such that me seeing it as final was almost an affront to them, because and I had to try to find a way to walk the path between what's true to me and what I think is true about how I grieve, and being able and entitled to my own way of grieving, and recognizing the fact that the way I was grieving, seeing it as final, seeing it as the end, seeing that there is no heaven and hell and like he's just gone, to them felt as though I wasn't acknowledging and affirming to them that their hope that they would see him again was something that they could hold on to as a comfort. And I wasn't able to offer that to them. And that was a struggle. Have you guys ever found that? Because I found walking that was a struggle, because I needed to be true to myself. I needed to be able and entitled to and set boundaries so that I could grieve in the way that made sense to me based on my beliefs. But because my beliefs are what they are, because Christianity seems to kind of have the market cornered on thinking that they own grief and have the best way to do it, it was difficult for me to bond with them and go through it with them, because I was I was walking such a different path than they were walking.
Yeah. I think that in general, I think that when people see your doubt as a threat to their belief, it's because they have doubt. And true believers, like the people I've known in my life who are just like 100% all in, like they're not threatened as far as I can tell. And I have people who are very close to me who are devoutly religious. Like, I don't think it bothers them, because I don't think that I can poke any holes in what they believe. That, you know, I think that it's the people who are like, there's a little opening here, and if you start poking at it, it's going to grow, and I don't want that can't handle this dynamic. But I think, you know, like even growing up, you know, secular, just in general out in the world, you know, whatever, something comes up in conversation and I said, oh, well, my dad passed away, and people just like say like, oh, well, he's watching over you, and like things like that I don't think are true, but
Yeah.
and it's like sometimes I'm like, okay, this is just like so I'm like, sometimes it's just thank you, right? When someone like you, God bless you, have a great day, thanks so much, like you don't have to get into it every time.
Yeah, pick your battles.
And so I'm like, okay, great, thanks. So and sometimes it really, by not saying something, you're agreeing, and that's really tough. But I think the crux of it is death is awkward. It's the taboo that, we are way more comfortable talking about so many things that used to be forbidden to talk about. But death, I have a girlfriend who I love that she'll say, like, anytime anything comes up about like remotely related to death, like, I think we're going to get life insurance. Do you have life insurance? She'll say, like, not to be morbid. And I'm like, morbid is like you're hanging around a crime scene. Acknowledging that, like, you're like, life is finite and we are mortal is not morbid. It's just like, you know what I mean? Like, that kind of stuff, I feel like it's so, like, it's so hard to talk about, and people are so uncomfortable talking about it. And so we don't have a language, especially if we're secular, to say like anything after like, I'm so sorry for your loss, like anything else. It just they feel
like platitudes to me. Like if I say something else, it just seems like a hollow platitude. Like I would rather say, how can I support you?
Right.
Like what do you need? Like than always watching over you. Like that's just such a way to just feel as though you did something and then walk away, to me.
And people grow up hearing that and hearing people say that, and they think it's the right thing to say. Just like whatever, someone sneezes and you say bless you, and you're not like, you know what I mean? But or you say gesundheit, which is like a little more secular. But like, I think that there's actually in Judaism, and my ancestor, like ethnically I'm Jewish, and like I have some of the cultural stuff, and like there is an expression in Judaism that is, may their memory be a blessing, which like still has like blessing in it. There's still some like stuff that is, feels theistic, but it's this idea that the way that for me at least, the way that I feel like it can transition into like a secular idea, that the way that they're going to live on is in our memories and how we are inspired to do better, or, carry on some tradition or legacy of theirs, or something that they worked hard for, whatever it is. And I think there are things that we can do and say that actually like have some weight and meaning, that don't make us liars when, and the other thing, a family friend, she was, a grown-up person when her dad died, and he was elderly, and she came into work a few days later afterwards, and a colleague, not someone that she knew very well, but somebody who, she's friendly with at the office, said, I'm so sorry to hear about your dad. What was he like?
Yeah, that's a great one.
And I thought, that's so beautiful. And just let her talk about, he liked this, he didn't like this, he was so funny, he did this all his life, and I just thought, wow, that is such a gift to just listen.
That's a really good point. And that even brings up like the funeral process, because so my husband's uncle died, and when we went to the funeral, it was basically a call to Jesus. It was an altar call. They had nothing to do with his life or who he was or anything else. It was just about get right with God, come on up here and be saved. It was so uncomfortable. Whereas when my dad died, we didn't have a service at all. Instead, we had a picnic at my mom's house. We played pool and we talked about it was just family. And we were remembering all the funny things, sayings that he had, or, it was just us getting together. My dad, we used to always say this, the only thing he ever wanted, like for Christmas or his birthday or anything, was the family to get together. If he could have everybody together, that's all he really wanted. And so that's what we did. We came together as a family, and we had kind of a celebration of life in a sense. And he was cremated. And so it was perfect. It was just what we needed. But there were other people that, were not invited, or that were like, wait a minute, I didn't see anything in the paper about a receiving, or, who were a little upset because they couldn't. And they, it's like, do whatever you feel that you need to do to honor my dad's life. This is what we had to do. And I think that's
Right.
a big thing that I see, is that it's very difficult for us to be able, as a secular person, to be able to grieve, because on top of the grief, we have to deal with how other people are trying to help us, like what you were saying, Shannon. So it's not just about our grief. It's about how are we receiving other people, and not just our family and trying to relate with them and connect with them, but other people that don't want to talk about death, or they don't know what to say. And they immediately go into platitudes like, God has a plan, or you'll see him later, or all of those things that are not comforting. But you know that they're not sure what to say. So you're almost suppressing your needs for everybody else's as well. And that can kind of stifle your own grieving process in a sense, don't you think?
I think religion doesn't necessarily like equip you with how to grieve. It instead tells you that you don't even necessarily need to, because you're going to see this person again. So instead of giving you the psychological tools that are required to traverse grief, it instead says, well, it's not even necessary, because this is a temporary state. So it keeps you in a state of grief that's going to grip you consistently and doesn't arm you with the tools. Like what Sasha said about your friend and saying, oh, what was he like being able to share those memories and being able to work through those emotions are what's important when it comes to grieving. But saying, oh, well, you'll see him again, that doesn't do any of that for you.
It's like toxic positivity. You know what I mean?
It
Like,
just
that's
gets you out of an interaction and makes you feel like you did something in it.
Totally. And I will say, I feel like it's just like, there are many religions and they don't all have like very clear ideas about afterlife, and some of them have different grieving processes. But I think what you're saying is totally fair about this idea that this is just like a little delay. And I'll meet you later I'll meet you at the after party. You know what I mean? It's a different thing than good night, And I think you're right. I think that but on the other hand, the thing that I think the paradox is if you are a member of a religious community, you get like all this, like people bringing you food, and you get like all this stuff that people who, in modern culture where people don't really live in the communities they grew up with and don't necessarily have a group of people around them in like an organized way. Like maybe you have a couple best friends, maybe you have a couple really kind social, coworkers or something like that, or social, acquaintances who like look out for you. But the idea that there is a network in place to come help, I mean, that is also like, I mean, there are so many people who stay in religious communities because it's their community, and not necessarily even that they believe, but just the idea that like when something bad happens or when something good happens, there's not going to be this network. And so I think for those of us who are secular, it really is like it's up to us to like show up in those moments and create communities that do that, because and this is true for secular or religious communities, but there is a moment, like when someone dies, even if they're old, even if they've been sick for a long time, it's shocking. Like the idea like that they are not there anymore, right? Everyone who has lost someone has had that experience of being like, oh, I can't wait to tell him. Oh no, I can't tell him that this happened. Or like, you know what I mean? Like the thing, you like go to pick up your phone and you're like, no. And like that feel, or like the feeling when you wake up in the morning and you're like, something's bad, what is it? And then you remember what's happened, And I think that like the way that your mind like slowly comes around to understanding what's happened also is like timed with like, in the first few days or the first week after a loss, everybody's there. People come in depending on how you do funeral rituals and things like that. Like, people come to town or people show up and they have food and they're checking in on you. And then after about a week or two, people go back to their lives and do their thing, which is of course normal. And that is sometimes the moment when you are actually wrapping your mind around the loss, and like it can be quite isolating. I have a girlfriend who from my hometown, and her dad was a beloved teacher at her high school, and he died a few years ago, and she and I had a really beautiful series of emails and conversations, and we hadn't really been in touch, but I reached out to her because her dad was this wonderful teacher. And the isolation, the feeling of being isolated, not that week, not the next week, but a month later, 2 months later, when everyone's sort of gone back to their lives, I think is like really something that we can, there's a way to do better. And I think that we can, work on creating communities and relationships where when something like this happens, we stick around.
I would love it. If the problem is though, with secular communities, and I've given talks on this too, is that it's so difficult to get them to coalesce, because really the only thing that unifies most of us is that we answered no to a question. Right. We answered no to a question. Aside from that, like, we don't necessarily know without discovering, because there's no scaffolding built around the social structure, that we have anything in common, that we have any shared goals, et cetera, et cetera. And those are the types of things that cohere and unify communities. So it takes more work. Like, you have to want to and desire to put in the effort. Like, that is one thing that religious communities kind of have the market cornered on, and they are beating us by leaps and bounds, is because they have those institutions built into the structural foundation of society, so much so that they're seen as the default.
And like a weekly date, or like be there or be square, like you know what I mean? I mean, that is so powerful. But I also think the community, like when I say a secular community, I don't necessarily mean like a church for atheists, but like your book club, or like like it could be partly some religious people and some secular people, like a group of people, your group of friends, your like, and I think one really powerful thing, kind of group, and it's a group where you do have shared values, is like if you volunteer, the people you volunteer with, like if you go somewhere like once a week, or I mean now it's like so much of it is virtual, but like in the before times when you would like go like stuff envelopes once a week, like at a big table somewhere, and be like, whatever, if it's political, if it's soup kitchen, whatever
sorting
it is,
food, I used to do that a lot.
Exactly. Right. Or like a volunteer, like tutoring, after school program, whatever it is, something like that. I feel like that is something that is like, you do have shared values, and you are often, not always, showing up somewhere on a regular basis with people. And I feel like that's a place where that can happen. But there's countless versions of this. It just sometimes someone has to take the lead to like make it, coalesce.
Yeah. Absolutely. One thing I wanted to talk about that we started behind the scenes talking about, Shannon, you mentioned that when your dad died, that, and I think this was behind the scenes, I don't think you mentioned it on camera, but it was about the need for mental health professionals.
Yeah.
And could you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that that's something that is, that we're just not doing, that we need wide scale.
So what happened was my father he went in for cancer surgery. It didn't go great, and he ended up having a stroke and was in a coma. So we had to take him off life support. So we had to have a meeting, like a family meeting. I'm the only atheist in the family. So we had a family meeting, and the doctors basically said, this is what's going to happen. Like, I'll meet with you again tomorrow to be extra sure. You don't have to make any decisions today. We'll give you a day to think about it. Like, people have been through it, know what it's like. And then you go back in the next day. But the last thing that they said before we left was, we can, like, what religion are you? We can get either a rabbi or a priest or a reverend or an imam to come in. We can make sure that they're here tomorrow. And I said, well, I'm an atheist, so my preference would be access to a grief counselor. And they said, we don't really offer that. You have to go through different channels outside of the hospital to get that. And I'm in Canada. Yeah. So you mean to tell me that the default, like our societal default in one of the worst moments in somebody's life where they have to make a decision like this, a decision that they have to live with for the rest of their life, to literally say that this person that I love, I am going to send the papers to say that you can let them stop breathing. The only available options for somebody to support us are religious. And if you're not religious, there are none. Mm-hmm. That hit me in the face like a brick. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it, because the default should be, tried and tested grief counselors should be what's immediately offered. And as an addendum, if you happen to be religious, of course you should be able to have people in there to do the rites and go through whatever ritual is required for your belief system. But that should be above and beyond grief counseling. Counseling is what should be the default, but it's not, because it so permeates our culture that the default for grieving is whatever religious institution you belong to. That is where you turn. That there is no infrastructure built for what all of us would really need, which is counseling and professional psychological care. That should be the default. So I would very much like to see more people talking about how that paradigm should change, especially in the moment, if not going forward. You shouldn't have to fight for that, but be immediately offered something that may or may not even help you, and is only, and I don't think is beneficial. They're certainly not trained in mental health. So yeah, that floored me. Floored
shocking.
Me. Yeah,
it is. I immediately think it's a larger societal problem. We don't prioritize mental health in the way that we should. I mean, mental health you should go to your therapist just like you go to your primary care physician, just like you go to your doctor. It should be something that you do all the time, and it shouldn't have any stigma associated with it, because we are all human beings with minds. We all have psychological processes, and we can all do better if we take care of our mental health and we have those resources. But especially when you're talking about grief and loss. I had another experience where I was 18 weeks pregnant and lost the baby, and had to go in and have an abortion done, which yes, that's an abortion, even though the baby was gone. Or the fetus was gone. If I had not gone in and had that, I could have gone into sepsis. And so it was very important to do that. And that is an abortion. But anyway, during that time, something that was a loss, just like when my dad died, and there was no one there at the hospital to help me through that process. There was no mental health. They didn't have anyone. They didn't even offer a religious person like they did for you with your dad. There was just nothing. It's like you wake up and here you go and see your doctor in a few days. Your primary care or your gynecologist, make sure you're okay. We've got to do better. And I'm thinking that maybe the secular community, that might be a way to kind of unify us, is by focusing on some of these issues. And I think that it has been doing that. That's been a big topic of discussion in a lot of the atheist groups, is about mental health and, trying to provide for a better community. Our well-being is important. I think that's been a big focus for us. What do you guys think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, the idea that, there are things that are evidence-based. There's some stuff that's, we're still working out. And the human mind is so complex, and we are new at understanding it. But this idea that the idea that I imagine that the stigma against mental health care is wrapped up with all sorts of old religious ideas of what makes us who we are, and why, how we're supposed to behave, and what's natural and what's not natural. And I think that if we were to unbraid some of that, we could really make progress and alleviate so much unnecessary suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. So we've talked a lot about the difference between religious and secular grief and loss, and that we often hear that the religious grief process of grief and loss is better than secular grief and loss. I think that we've all agreed that that's not necessarily the reality of the situation. That Shannon, you had mentioned about that you have you're not stuck. We're not stuck in thinking that we're going to see them again, but instead we are grounded in the reality of finality. Kind of, if that makes sense. So, how do you feel? Either one of you feel that we can better address this disparity between the way that the secular response to grief and loss versus the religious grief and loss, especially in regard to our family and friends, and when they are talking to us about this stuff, how can we better respond? We've talked about, that they don't always give us what we need, and we're having to constantly think about not just our own grief, but being careful and cognizant of their needs, even our friends' needs, and how they're responding to us. What do you think that we can do to better bridge that gap?
Well, the same way that I felt like in the most recent instance when I lost Dad, that I was very staunch that, I was entitled to my grieving process. I wasn't going to let anybody else co-opt it. I needed to make sure that I was cognizant of the fact that I was also making space for everybody else to be entitled to their grieving process. It wasn't a time to, break out the kalam and refute it in front of them. You know what I mean? Like that wasn't a time for me to debate which person's religious perspective was accurate. I needed to be aware of how they needed to be supported in the moment. But that being said, I also didn't want to do what I perceived as placating, right? I didn't want to just give blank platitudes because that's what, other people were giving to me, and I know that I didn't receive them well. So I would allow them to have the room without criticizing how they were grieving. Like when they said, he's in a better place and I feel better that I'm going to see him again. I didn't deign to be like, well, you're not going to see him again. You could probably deal with, could you imagine? So instead I just kind of acknowledged them and said, well, how do you feel like you're going to need to be supported? Did you want to talk to me about Dad? Is there any stories that we could share together? What's something that maybe you knew about him that I didn't, that we could talk about now? If there was something that you think that he would say right now, what would he say? How do you think he would enjoy this? I found ways to interact with them, allowing them the space to work through their emotions as well. I always try to receive everybody's emotions with as much empathy as possible. So whatever space they were in, I just provided room for that and allowed them to feel as though this was a comfortable, safe space to be open. And if their being open meant that they wanted to talk about how they felt about God in that moment, I allowed them to do it. I didn't necessarily reinforce it, but I would say things like, I can see how much that means to you. And then I would move back to having conversations about, who he was and how we're going to move forward. And, if there were people that were very well integrated in his life, I would say things like, well, is there something that's going to be impactful to you now that he's gone that you may need support in? How can I help work through that with you? I found ways to make it about their real life and how his absence was going to impact their real life and how I was going to support them there without attempting to negate what they needed to do in the moment, because that's how they were taught. when it came to, incorporating religion into their grief process. So I guess, like, just more succinctly say it, which I promised I would be, but evidently I'm not. I tried to make space for them to allow that, but also work my way back to grounding them in the reality of the loss and what it was going to mean, and work through that with them as the most important part, without undermining the fact that they felt like that was important to them to incorporate.
I like that answer. Sasha, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, people say all kinds of things when there's a huge amount of emotion, and so often it's about that. You know what I mean? Even if it's it's a reveal about them. But what I'm sort of fascinated with is for those people who are, for example, Christian and believe strongly in an afterlife, like, is there, and this is as a person who, like, wasn't raised Christian, so to both of you, like, if it were really a relief, and if it really were the source of, like, it's okay, it's just gonna, especially, some, like, let's say the person who's bereaved is older, like, if it's really like, okay, it's like 10 or 20 years or whatever, and then we're gonna be in paradise together, like, if it really helps, like, shouldn't people be, like, significantly less upset, like, when there's a loss? Like, is there a cognitive dissonance? Is there, like, something that, like, where the emotions that the person is expressing and experiencing reveal doubt? Because I don't know, I feel like I just think the emotion of, I am never going to see this person again, this is the absolute final end of their life, is a different thing to experience than, it's going to be a couple of decades, but we're going to be together again, and it's going to be amazing, best place ever. Like, that just seems like it would not evoke the same. And I'm asking this, like, totally frankly, like, it's not rhetorical. Like, is there a difference? Do you see a difference in the way that people who are true believers react to loss versus people who are secular? Like, does it work?
Before the show, Shannon and I were actually talking about that, because I do see with my religious friends that they have a much harder time. They seem to be stuck in this perpetual grief for a long time, whereas me, I mean, I'm the only secular person in the people that I know, and I don't feel, it feels like my loss was dealt with in a much healthier way, because I'm not crippled by it every anniversary where, and Shannon, I wanted to preface that because you had a really great response, and I think Sasha would benefit from it.
Well, I think that the difference is that they're awaiting reunification, right? So every year that passes is another year that they're separated, that to their mind they don't need to be, right? Because they're going to be unified. Like, so they're in a waiting pattern, right?
Yeah.
And whereas I reached a terminus, because I'm not in that holding pattern. I recognize that this is the end, so I am able to build coping strategies around that recognition. They never get to that point of recognition, and instead are consistently reliving the phases of awaiting that reunification, and wondering what that means to their life now too. Like, could you imagine, for example, like, if you married young, husband passes away when you're in your 20s, like, when you get married again, if you're a true believer, now you're not just moving on with your life and finding a way to be happy and coping. On top of that, you have this additional layer of, am I also betraying this person, right?
Is he watching?
Watching. Am I betraying this person? Or conversely, if you don't get remarried, you're sacrificing happiness.
Right.
because you think that you're going to be unified with them again. If you lose a child, you're potentially just biding time because you just, the grief is so deep because you lost that child, that all you can do is just hope and wait until basically your life is over so you can be with them again. So every moment is painful because you're waiting.
Yeah.
I'm not waiting for anything.
Right.
I know it's done. And as such, I can build strategies to move forward. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be painful, but it's going to be painful in more final ways that I can cope with better, because I'm not also still holding on to what I see as kind of an empty hope that's tying me to this person in a way that I don't think that they would want me to be tied to them. While I'm in this holding pattern, waiting to be reunified with them again. And like I said before the show, I'm not sure if I think you were here for this, but like the more I thought about the afterlife and the Christian conceptualization anyway, the more it didn't make sense to me anyway, because,
Right.
like I said, my father was, nominal Christian, like he wasn't super religious, but theoretically he could be in heaven. I can't conceive of it. And I am definitely an atheist, and that shit's not changing. So like, I'm not going there, right? No matter what, whether you're an annihilationist or whether you believe in a hell, I'm not going there. So I just, as a parent myself, I have an 11-year-old. I can't imagine being happy knowing I'm going to be eternally separated from a child. Like who would I be in that scenario? It just doesn't make sense. And is that who he is now? Is he happy? So what does that mean? Like the more you hold it to scrutiny, the more the idea of it, even as a hope, kind of unravels too.
Oh,
so
totally.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think that's that whole question of like holding it to scrutiny. Like if you consider that a value, like we were saying before, like if that's something that is like something really valuable and important to hold ideas to scrutiny, to question, then you're going to go down one road. But if you are told from, infancy that questioning is dangerous, and that, heresy and blasphemy and all these, things are, and losing your faith is really bad for you, then you don't pick it apart because you've been told like it's like a stove you don't touch, you know what I mean? And it's, I think that idea that getting into the details of how this would all work and like, who are we if we're in heaven and everything's like great all the time, then like how does life work? And like all these like the minutia of it is really, the scrutiny is really, I think the crux of it is like, does it make sense when you start to question it, if you agree that questioning ideas is a good thing to do?
I sometimes wonder if the people that do hold to it see questioning as almost like stealing their hope. Like they have an emotional investment with it. So they have an emotional reaction because they see you saying, okay, well, maybe this isn't the case.
Right.
Maybe it's better to view it as finite and cope and move forward. And maybe it doesn't make sense. People aren't necessarily, purely logical creatures, right? We're more emotional creatures by leaps and bounds. So if that's something that you tie a lot of your emotional well-being to, it's like, if that's the string that's holding the tapestry together and you pull at it, then they have to reconstruct everything. It's not even just getting rid of their hope. It's unraveling so many different things that they've conceived of.
And I'm sure it feels like an attack. I mean, we've all had that. I mean, it doesn't even have to be something theological. You just like, you think whatever, someone's really great who you just met, and someone's like, actually, they're terrible. And you're like, stop. Like, you know what I mean? Like, or whatever. You have like, oh, you liked that movie? Here are all the reasons it was really derivative and like not very clever or whatever. You know what I mean? Like there's a million things you have on a smaller scale where the stakes are lower, where like it feels like it hurts when someone takes apart something that you think or believe or want to believe. Like it's painful, of course. I can for sure see why it's unpleasant to hear the other side of it. But I think that's a different question than.
But also, like, where does that leave us
is it
to?
real?
Because most of the people we're surrounded with are the people that have that tapestry that we can't pull the
Right.
string.
Right.
So
I think the answer is making a secular, science-based, evidence-based worldview really joyful and beautiful and its own thing, and not just a reaction to religion, but actually a more traditional way of looking at things. If we go back before, my mom calls it post-Copernican stress disorder, right? For most of history.
I love that.
Yeah, like if the more deeply we understood ourselves, our planet, the universe, the stars, the more deeply we understood nature, and for a lot of people, by extension, our gods or God, and like the idea that like that craving to understand what we're part of, and like paying attention to how the seasons change and how the animals migrate and where the, what the stars are doing and how the days are getting longer and shorter, like that was, that is the most ancient, right? That is that's the most traditional. And I think taking that and finding the beauty in that and the, awe and wonder in that, just as its own thing, just,
it resonates with me, because that's one of the reasons that I started studying neuroscience.
Yeah.
Because I was like, well, if this piece of meat is us,
right,
if this is me, I want to know everything there is about it. Like the best way for me to know me is to know what's going on here. And that just like opened my world so much. Like I have such a richer understanding of experience, and I have so much more reverence for how I interact with the world and how I perceive the world now than I ever did before, when I was only seeing it superficially and taking it at face value. I wish more people had your gusto and your your enthusiasm.
Well, it's the gusto that I was bequeathed to me by my parents.
Well, they did a good job.
Thank you. But no, I really think that's the way to go. Is it's not you can't. Of course there's some low hanging fruit and some high hanging fruit in religion that it's hard not to just be like, that doesn't make any sense. But I think that like just having our own thing that is like uplifting and joyful and like holds up. And when it doesn't hold up, and when there's some scientific concept that under more scrutiny or more information or more research doesn't hold water, we let it go and say, oh, well, that's not true. We thought that was true. We didn't understand.
The freedom to change your mind and learn is
and I think that I think the more that we can just have a way of looking at things that its own thing and not just a reaction to the shortcomings of religion, I think then also I think we just get more flies with honey than with vinegar, so that helps too.
So with our last 8 minutes or so, what do you feel are some tips or tricks or a pathway to give to our secular audience if they are experiencing grief or loss? How can they have healthy ways, or what are some healthy ways to deal with that? What do you guys think as far as the person who is grieving goes?
I think it varies person to person. So it depends on the grief and where you are in your grief. Everybody has a different underlying disposition, right? So any advice that I give to one person may not be viable for another person. So the first thing that I would say is, if it's something that's available to you and plausible, like find a grief counselor, find somebody who can help guide you through the process with your mental health in mind, like something like Sasha said, very fact-based and evidence-based therapeutic strategies. That would be the first set of advice. I know that that's not something available to everybody. The second thing, and Sasha will probably mirror it because she said it a million times, is kind of like build a coalition around you. Get people that you trust that support you around you, and share your feelings honestly with them, and allow them to support you. It's a lot of us, I think, feel as though we have to do something like grief alone, especially if we're secular. But you can reach out to people. If you don't feel like there's people that are close to you can reach out to, and counseling's not an option, there are free lines that you can call that can direct you to resources. I always like to drive people toward mental health resources and building support structures, like social support structures around themselves as the first go-to places. After that, there's nuance. It depends on what about it is hitting you. So I don't want to give anything that's too generic, because it may not be applicable to somebody else's specific circumstance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think the mental health piece is so powerful. And just the idea that, like, it's like, even if the person was sick for a long time, even if the person is very elderly, even if it's someone you didn't know that well, but you just can't stop thinking about it, like, it is sad. It is like, these emotions are so powerful and so normal, and just like, there's no reason to like fight it. Like, be sad. It is okay. I mean, get support, of course, but it's just like, don't, like, the shoulds of like, oh, well, this much time has passed, or I didn't even know them that well, or whatever it is that is like robbing you of the feeling of like grief, like that you didn't like earn it. Just like let go of that, and just like, it is one of the innate experiences of being a human being on earth. It could, maybe it's, you know, the defining experience in certain ways. Some of the earliest evidence of human culture is the way we, you know, buried or prepared or honored our dead. You know, this is like a very profound, deep thing. And I think just acknowledging that this is a part of the human experience, and that it comes in waves. I think, you know, that is a huge part of it. Like, and you'll be having like a great day, and months will have gone by, and then a song comes on, or you think of something, or you find a little post-it note that has their handwriting on it, or something, anything like that. And it just to be prepared that it's not a linear pattern in terms of like more time equals less grief. That is not how it works. And also, I would say that, especially if you've lost someone really close to you, especially young, the at least my experience is, as you go on through time, it's a horrible club that no one wants to be in, but you will meet other people who also have the same experience, and it will bond you. And you will have, even if when it happens, you don't have anyone who understands what you've gone through, you will meet people who know what it's like, and it will help.
Yep, absolutely. So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, I love that advice. That's great. Like the fact that you're entitled to your grief, and that you should allow yourself to go through it and not try to rationalize yourself out of it, or, you know, give yourself reasons that you don't deserve it. You know, there's no such thing as deserving a feeling that you have. You just have them. So yeah,
and just let it wash over you.
Yeah, that's such a good and profound point. That's very poignant. It's good advice.
And also, you won't feel this way forever. However bad it feels, like you won't. I mean, you may always have that loss and love for that person, and there may always be some pain there, but the really difficult parts, you will not feel that way forever. Like, I promise.
Yeah, I think that's really important. You both said something that just really caught me, and that's giving yourself permission to grieve, and however you're going to grieve, and know that it's okay, and you may not be like everybody else. I think that's extremely profound, especially in our society where you're supposed to be so strong. You know, that's what is revered, is, you know, you handle it well and handle it with class and dignity and grace and all that stuff.
That's part of mental health stigma.
Right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So, speaking of which, along the bottom of the screen for this show, there has been some resources, and I want to quickly touch on them. One is Grief Beyond Belief, and they have some really great resources. They have a whole list of posts and articles and so forth about just about every topic having to do with grief. And then the second one is Secular Therapy Project. That is one. There was someone in the chat that said that it took them, let's see, it was purple rhymes with orange. It's been 8 years and nope, not that one. Hold on. I thought it was that one. There was one that said that they had, oh, here it is. It was still the same person. I had to search for 4 months just to find a therapist that didn't mention religion or spiritual healing in the first paragraph of their webpage. Exactly. So reach out to the Secular Therapy Project because they are fantastic. I want to see what y'all have for your final thoughts on this topic. We'll go with you, Sasha.
I would just say, that there is so much beauty and wonder and joy in being alive. Just right this moment. Here we are. If you're listening to this, or you're on this planet, and like having this experience of being alive, and the fact that it's not forever doesn't make it less wondrous. I think it actually makes it more wondrous.
Absolutely. And Shannon?
I would just say them being gone doesn't take away from a single second of what you had while they were here. And that's what's important, what you had with them. And you're entitled to your grief. It's completely normal. Like Sasha said, it won't last forever. And you're not alone, and you'll be okay. You will be okay. Let it hurt. It's supposed to. Get support when you need it. You deserve it. And you'll be okay. You'll be okay. It'll be different, but you'll be okay.
Excellent. So for all of you that were out there, I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I want to thank Shannon and Sasha for coming on and having this discussion. I think it's so important, and it's not talked about enough. There's just not a lot of resources readily available for the secular community, as we've discussed tonight. So I want to thank both of you guys for coming on and talking about this. If you are in the audience, please remember to like, subscribe, share, hit the bell. We enjoy bringing good content to you. And if you want to help us in another way, you can join our Patreon. I want to thank our patrons, Bass Thrasher, Kathy Cotton, Cindy Plaza, Bryce, Deborah Grace, Aaron Coalson, Phil Calderone, and myself. That will allow us to continue to do better and better. I want to thank our producers, Wes, Phil, and Kat, and the booking team, Wes, Raymond, and James. Remember to check out our other shows on Skeptic Haven. We have Secular Soapbox, Women Atheists Unload, Global Atheist, and The Bible Says What. So be sure and check all of those out. And until next time, remember to always think critically. Good night, everybody.